Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the International Relations Council for this deep dive into the effectiveness of economic sanctions. This program is part of the IRC lecture series, which since our first speaker, Eleanor Roosevelt, in 1955, has offered nuanced insight and broad perspective on critical global issues. My name is Matthew Hughes, and I serve as the Executive Director of the International Relations Council in Kansas City, and we're so glad to have you with us today. The International Relations Council strengthens Kansas City's global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. As a nonpartisan educational nonprofit organization, the IRC values informed civil discourse, accessibility, and substance as we work to sharpen our community's 21st century global acumen. Whether you're joining us live this evening or watching the recording of this program later, we invite you to learn more about the International Relations Council, including other upcoming events and how to join the IRC as a member on our website at irckc.org. Economic sanctions can be a powerful tool for national governments and multinational organizations as they look to protect their interests, exert influence, and reach desired outcomes in challenging geopolitical situations. Sanctions against China, Venezuela, Syria, Russia, and Iran have made the news in recent years, but what brought them about and how effective have they been? Today, we'll explore the rationale behind unilateral and multilateral economic sanctions, the extent of their use and their effectiveness and broader ramifications. We hope you'll be an active participant this evening. We certainly welcome your thoughtful questions through the course of the conversation using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And do check out and share other upcoming conversations in the IRC lecture series as we consider a range of critical global issues in the coming months. Without the generosity of people like you, the IRC wouldn't be able to host events like this. If you'd like to give and make events like this possible, you can text IRC to 44321. Again, please text IRC to 44321 and make a donation. It's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this evening's program, who will introduce our speaker and help us navigate the conversation. Clayton Webb is an associate professor of political science at the University of Kansas, an IRC organizational member. He received his PhD from Texas A&M University in 2015. His research focuses on economic sanctions, public opinion, and topics in political methodology. His work has been featured in the American Journal of Political Science, Political Analysis, International Interactions, among other prominent outlets, and he's currently working on a Cambridge University Press book, A Practical Introduction to Applied Time Series Analysis. Clayton, thanks so much for being here with us this evening. The floor is yours.
Is it? Can you see me? Oh, there we go. There we go. All right, sorry. Thank you, Matthew. So my name is Clayton Webb, and thank you to the International Relations Council for hosting this event. It's my distinct privilege to introduce our main speaker for this evening, George Lopez. George is the Hesburgh Professor of Peace Studies at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Since 1992, George has advised various international agencies and governments regarding sanctions issues, ranging from limiting their humanitarian impact on the design of targeted financial sanctions. He has written, often with David Cartwright, 45 articles and books, as well as authored, edited 7 books on economic sanctions. From October 2010 through July 2011, he served on the United Nations panel of experts for monitoring and implementing UN sanctions on North Korea. He writes frequently for Sanctions for the Hill and the Responsible Statecraft of the Quincy Institute in DC, where he serves as a non-resident fellow. George, the floor is yours.
Clay, thank you very much. I'm assuming people can hear me as well. And let me add my thanks to the International Relations Council, the good folks at Kansas City there in the audience, to Matt Hughes for bringing us all together, and especially to Evan Verplu, who really set up so much of the logistics of us being able to do this effectively. And part of the effectiveness, I hope, will be that you can see the PowerPoint that I'm about to share with you. I'm going to use the PowerPoint as something that is a takeaway for you all in this talk this evening, and certainly accessible for those who are going to be joining us after the fact and playing the tape. Effectiveness of economic sanctions is a real important issue. Top of the list of some U.S. foreign policy questions. I want to share observations of my 30 years of working both in scholarship and in practice with sanctions with you, and then going to enjoy the conversation and questions from Clay and certainly the ones from you in the audience. Let's begin with, what are sanctions? Sanctions are an economic tool of foreign policy that essentially involve a major interruption, if not a withdrawal, of normal economic exchanges of trade, aid, and increasingly of various financial dealings. Why? In order to attain a political goal. The political reasons that drive sanctions will be many. Sometimes they'll have to do with the major offense of the party that's targeted, as they've violated a major international law or international norm. Sometimes it'll be because of a brewing crisis between two countries, and one country, usually the more powerful, will respond with this method of trying to extract a concession from the target. In a sense, sanctions have long been driven by a basic theory. If you increase the economic pain on a target to extract political concessions and decisions, you'll get the outcomes you wouldn't get from some other way, short of military force. Many people talk about sanctions as lying halfway in between just diplomatic protest and going to war. That land in between there is quite vast, in fact, and the needle of what sanctions will do, either in moving closer and closer to war or staying with diplomacy, often determines whether or not sanctions are successful. Now, sanctions have a long and really interesting history. We have evidence that the Greek city-states used sanctions as a way to avoid war, turning back and preventing ships from going to rival city-states and increasing their economic wealth that might build up their war machine. All of that was operative long, long before our modern Westphalia system of the states. After the 16th century, sanctions become more frequent, actually, as the first volley, if you will, of part of a war strategy. Cutting off trade and embargoing or blockading the ports, not only of your rival, but maybe of the ports of those who were heavy traders with them. We're going to concentrate this evening on 20th century sanctions, particularly those that emerged after the Cold War. That said, we know that in the Q&A, there'll probably be some really good questions on the longest lasting sanctions within the American experience, and that is those that began in Cuba in the early 60s and still endure, and those that began in 1979 against the new regime in Iran. And we're happy to talk about all those individual cases. I want to focus, though, on this modern history of the last 30 years. The immediate positive Cold War and post-Cold War environment, the kind of rapprochement between the Western Bloc and the Soviet Bloc, the end of nuclear targeting in its major sense, the united approach that all parties all of a sudden had among the permanent five of the Security Council, with Russia and China on the one hand and the United States and its allies on the other, regular foes for the first 45 years of the existence of the Security Council, now found an opportunity to do more and more agreement about things like peacekeeping forces, and in particular, right away, a challenge of economic sanctions. When Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait 31 years ago in August, the Security Council turns to this measure from its charter for the first time in this new world order of the 1990s. And they use it as a strong trade and comprehensive embargo to tell Saddam, look, it's time to leave Kuwait, and if you don't, you'll be a victim of military force. And we know how that first Gulf War unfolded then about a year later. What's distinctive about that breakthrough is that it led the United Nations to use sanctions 14 times in the next 10 years, which led the 1990s to be labeled the sanctions decade. And sanctions decade will continue in 2 further decades under UN auspices and other nation states joining this, in a way in which the largest number of sanctions by the UN is 19 in a couple of different years in the last 3 decades, now stands at 14. But the United States has a series not only of its own sanctions where they're building from UN sanctions, but also those that we engage in against other nations or entities on our own, like the sanctions on Russia or the sanctions on Cuba. Those now number 30 targets. And the United Kingdom, one of our good allies in Britain, just under 30 targets. The European Union, even more expansive than the United States with 30 targets. So sanctions are very, very operative as a form not only of economic statecraft, but obviously as a form of economic coercion to find a way to attain political goals short of war. As I mentioned, this sanctions decade starts out with major comprehensive sanctions against various states like the former Yugoslavia, Haiti, certainly Iraq, and then moves to African conflicts as a way to try to end civil war. These punishing comprehensive sanctions, though, are seen as maybe a bit too over the top and too affecting innocent civilians, that by the end of the decade, there's a development of what's called smart sanctions. And the first set of smart sanctions are actually sent against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda before 9/11, but in late 99, because of activities oppressing human rights and constraining religious freedom in that country. This leads to the phenomenon of what we called specially designated nationals or designated entities, a move from targeting governments and leaders of government to targeting the individuals, either in government or individuals like terrorists, for shutting down their assets, putting them on no travel lists, and in a sense, moving the United Nations from a position of just targeting governments to now targeting individuals as violators of international law. 4 goals dominated the sanctions enterprise after the 1990s. The first, sanctions were used as a way to try to end war, to end violent conflict. And they had reasonable success in a number of cases in Liberia, Sierra Leone. You'll notice almost all these violent conflicts are ones of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s in sub-Saharan Africa. The difference, of course, is the Russia-Ukraine dispute, which is not a UN sanction, it's the United States, and it's actually Russia and Ukraine sanctioning large numbers of their own citizens, one against the other. The second big theme in UN and international use of sanctions is to prevent or to respond to international terrorism. These are the counterterrorism sanctions that get real power after 9/11, but also operated beforehand as punishment against Libya for its role in bringing down the air flight over Lockerbie. I mentioned the earlier sanctions against Al-Qaeda and Taliban. The post-9/11 situation creates a whole new targeted counter-terrorism regime with a special emphasis on its adaptability to groups beyond Al-Qaeda. So it was not difficult for the international community to sanction ISIS after the mid-2000s when they appear. A third area for sanctions is a way to try to protect human rights from brutal dictators and civilians from experiencing mass atrocities, either from those same dictators or as a possibility that's unfolding in war. DRC, Côte d'Ivoire, Libya, as the big cases where this happens. Failures in Rwanda, where the sanctions aren't imposed until after almost everyone's dead in 94 through the genocide. Minuscule sanctions relative to the atrocities in Darfur, and the non-case of our current decade, that is not passing sanctions from the UN and very few from many states against Syria in the last decade of that brutal war. The fourth area for sanctions work has been to control the development of weapons of mass destruction, particularly the development of nuclear weapons. So we call these counter-proliferation sanctions. Believe it or not, these were in effect at the mid 70s in the first batch of South Africa sanctions, as South Africa was accumulating the materials to build a nuclear weapon. Relatively unknown in this generation that that was the case, but there's a way in which South Africa was the first test case of what we would do in Iraq or later in Libya and Iran. The more contemporary cases are the ones of Iraq in the early 90s, Libya a little bit later, and currently the ones that dominate our focus both internationally and in US foreign policy, North Korea and Iran. The shift I mentioned in the late 90s from comprehensive trade sanctions and big embargoes of that type to something else called smart sanctions was a particular growth out of the anti-money laundering movement that captured large amounts of money of drug dealers and others running illicit criminal enterprises. The success of doing that, both with e-technologies and banking systems and intelligence units, combining in the 90s, left us in the international arena with a whole new set of tools that many in international finance felt could provide a real assistance to the sharpening and targeting of sanctions against the national leaders responsible for the bad policies or those who were strong supporters of them who aided that. In other words, you don't sanction a whole population anymore. You don't deny all businesses from operating. You just focus on the most critical ones that are benefiting or tied to the administration of the country. So the logic of this is a little bit like on the military side, we know about precision guided missiles or munitions. This was precision guided economic statecraft in which the heavy penalties were supposed to be paid by the leadership responsible for the policies. It included things like freezing the overseas assets in bank accounts held by these rich cronies in Zurich, Geneva, New York, London, Hong Kong, targeting their family members and not allowing Christmas club trips and various other things to New York to buy dresses and shoes, denying dictators the tuition money and access of their children coming to Princeton or Harvard. This was serious stuff in which the personal became political, and those use of targeted sanctions were very frequent and often very important to the success of sanctions ventures. A more extensive targeted sanctions was going after the financial markets and the banking systems of the countries, particularly to freeze bank assets that were tied to the wealth of the government. Suspending credits of aid, blocking loans from international agencies added to the financial squeeze. It's also the case that there were sanctions that were kind of the last tough straw on the camel's back to cajole a country. Certainly flight and travel bans were significant, especially if you denied visas to important people and denied visas to a segment of the population that supported the policy that was considered illegal. It was certainly important in terms of educational opportunities for the children of elites that they couldn't travel outside the country. So too was a focus on denying participation of a national team in sports. This was very hurtful to a number of South Africans. They told us years later that we denied the rugby team access to international sporting activities during the apartheid sanctions. And certainly the case of North Korea has been the most famous for what it means to control specific luxury goods that are snuck into the country in defiance of the sanctions. With all of these kinds of options, the movement from trade to these kinds of targeted measures, it's important to ask what leads to sanction success. A couple of things I can share with you from both the sanctions learning we've done through research and what's worked in practice. It's important to see that sanctions are a tool. They work best when they're one of a number of diverse foreign policy tools that are used to achieve success, and the success is defined by a broad strategic objective. In other words, in order to guarantee that North Korea doesn't develop and use long-range missiles to launch nuclear weapons, sanctions plays this role, but then other activities of the government of the United States and the community play these roles. Sanctions must, in targeting, not only enrage the target and really make the sting hurt economically, but actually have a political side in which you engage the target. Sanctions don't work without diplomacy, and diplomacy building off the strength of the coercive measures to not wait for the other side to cry uncle, but to find a way to dialogue about whether or not more pain is necessary through more sanctions, or we're ready to compromise now on certain kinds of activities. Sanctions have worked to do the things that we'd like to have happen with Iran and North Korea. They've worked early on with Iran in 2015 and the JCPOA agreement, in which sanctions over 3 years brought the Iranians to the table and established a given nuclear agreement. They helped Ukraine give up its nuclear devices early on at the end of the Cold War. They worked, as I mentioned, against South Africa and Libya. But sanctions stimulated end of nuclear programs has to work combined with that strong diplomacy, which provides new security guarantees to a country to convince them they don't need to rely on nuclear weapons for their security against enemies. And we usually add an important economic package of incentives to grease the wheels to get a close down of the nuclear programs. Sanction success relies increasingly on the ability to implement and enforce sanctions and not have the sanctions busters, illicit enterprises in finance, illicit goods exchange, underground shipping, all of that undercut the economic bite of sanctions. Sanctions, which are very, very punitive, particularly on banking sectors, and which aim to close down an entire economy, become worse even than comprehensive sanctions, they rarely succeed. So the notion that you have all these economic tools and you can strangle the country, strangulation actually doesn't work. That we've seen in a number of cases over the last 2 decades. Arms embargoes, if they're tight and they work with multilateral cooperation, they work. You heard a lot in the last decade about, let's use sanctions so strongly to change that regime in Venezuela or Iran or elsewhere. Well, sanctions have never toppled a regime. Sanctions work to deteriorate the quality of the work of the regime, but they don't topple it. And the most challenging area of sanctions now, not only in implementation, but design, is what we do with technology and communications control, particularly if you're trying to punish a bad actor who's hurting their population and not at the same time squeeze the population itself out of the technology market. A couple of problems to list before we open it up. The use of sanctions is loaded, I say, with good intentions and good design, but poor in practice. That dynamic of diplomacy is important in a cooperative dynamic. The political temptation to use all of these smart sanctions to hit different sectors, different people, different ways continually has been the mistake of the application of sanctions in many cases. That dynamic reinforces a bad regime to just dig in its heels more. Thus, sanctions work only about a quarter of 33% of the time. That's not a good range, except if maybe you're a baseball player and you're hitting 333, but it's lousy for effective policy. And when sanctions don't work because of this, what happens is the cases begin to build and become a major political crisis. For a while, a couple of years ago, remember, we felt that the entire Western Hemisphere was based on whether or not Maduro stayed in charge in Venezuela. And we kept pumping and pumping and pumping the sanctions and pumping up the level of the crisis, far beyond what it needed to be. More and more, despite their targeting, despite their intention, smart sanctions hurt the innocent populations that are not responsible for the policy. And worse yet, the structure of banking sanctions, creates difficulty for groups like Mercy Corps, the International Red Cross, Catholic Relief Services for doing business in some of these countries because these aid agencies have long relied on the local banking system. Sanctions that are the kind that designate entities in lists, they've become a disaster. We said there are only 30 instances of the United States having sanctions on countries and big entities. Yes, but the number of individuals listed by the US Treasury Department who are subject to sanctions is almost 11,000. So this has gotten a whole new dimension that we didn't envision 20 years ago. And it's not without the case that US businesses and banks sometimes suffer at the early and ongoing stages of sanctions, and we'll probably get into that in our Q&A. Final words. turn it over to Clay thereafter. Sanctions are one tool in the economic statecraft toolbox we have, sometimes misused, increasingly misunderstood, but they're here to stay. So some of us hope we can get this right. Multilateral sanctions still work better than unilateral sanctions imposed by a single country. The kinds of work that Clay and I do in sanction scholarship, it's useful, but like a posse trying to catch up with the bad guys, we can't capture all the various dimensions and dilemmas that are associated with making a particular instance of sanctions work. I think sanctioners don't rely enough on the flip side of the sanctions coin, which is beyond punishment. Sometimes there's incentivizing behavior through the application of monetary and financial resources. I'm one who believes that it's kind of a minority that sanctions can be both effective, humane, and successful if the cases and conditions are right. Thank you very much, and I'll welcome Clay having first shot at the questions.
All right, let's see. I have selected that. Okay, there we go. All right. So thank you, George. So in my role as moderator, I've been asked to field some questions from the audience. Before I do, I've also been asked to offer some questions of my own. Among other things, my research considers the role of economic sanctions in U.S. foreign policy, and I have a series of questions that are relevant to some of those areas where the research overlaps with the topics that you highlighted in your presentation. The first thing I want to ask you about is sanction threats. So speaking as an academic who's interested in studying economic sanctions as a foreign policy tool, there are two perspectives on how we can conceptualize economic sanctions. For many years, the standard approach was to treat economic sanctions as discrete events that begin when sanctions are imposed and end when sanctions are lifted. But a more contemporary approach to research on sanctions treats sanctions as continuous episodes that evolve over time, that begin with sanctions threats. So the new consensus that has sort of developed has led to differing perspectives on the effectiveness of economic sanctions. If we only look at imposed economic sanctions, they only work about a third of the time. But if we include sanctions threats, we can incorporate an important feature of sanction episodes that isn't captured by that measure, which is that sanctions are really only imposed in the cases where they're least likely to succeed, which are the situations where the threat of economic sanctions isn't sufficient to elicit concessions from the target state. And so I'm wondering, based on your experience and sort of the work you've done, if you can comment on the effectiveness of economic sanctions threats, as well as imposed economic sanctions as tools of economic statecraft.
Yeah, this is a great question, Clay, because it's a debate among the scholarly community, as you know. I'm of the persuasion that the research on threats doesn't spend enough time looking at the characteristics of those who were threatened with the sanctions in two ways. One is sanctions have such a low percentage of success after the imposition, often because of the willingness of the target to wait it out, endure, and maybe even the capacity of leadership in the target state to deflect to their opposition and other groups rather than their own elite group, the impact and the effect of sanctions. And so under those conditions, threaten me all you want, and then you have to go impose because I'm still going to wait it out. And so I do think the threats of sanctions do have a higher impact often when you're dealing with countries that you have more economic exchange with than those that you have less. So we're more likely, for example, to be able to have an impact with threat or even imposition on a Venezuela because of the high degree of exchanges between our two countries than we would on North Korea, where we're relatively isolated from one another economically. So I don't want to dismiss the importance of threat, but I do believe that the position that you have to impose sanctions because your threats have been weak, failed to recognize maybe the stubbornness and economic capability to evade sanctions is part of what needs to be into that equation. I do think that threats are ones that fit in what I would call the pre-sanction stage that might have a long life, and it's hard to specify a threat. So for example, let's take Donald Trump in the case of the renewal of Iran sanctions. He ran on it as a platform to be elected president. He later threatened it for the first year of the presidency and then finally delivered. Your own good work shows when he delivers and announces it a policy, boy, stock markets, currency values, all sorts of other stuff fluctuate. And that's true. But guess what? That currency fluctuation in Iran stabilized after a week because having experienced a year and a half of the likelihood that Trump would deliver on this, they battened down the hatches and were able to protect themselves in the first year or two of these maximum pressure sanctions. So I like the idea that there's a lot of research going on in threat. I think threats vary from case to case. I love it if it's really a 50% batting average, but I'm a little skeptical.
So yeah, the 50% batting average gets at a second question that I wanted to raise, which is sort of the distinction that sometimes exists in the literature between high politics and low politics. So this is another difference in sort of the standard perspective and this newer perspective on economic sanctions. And it's one that attempts to draw a distinction between high politics, which are some of the things you highlighted: proliferation, support for terrorism, human rights violation, and low politics, which is a moniker that is somewhat pejorative about the sort of more mundane activities of international politics, about monetary policy, disputes over lumber, fisheries, and what have you. And so in the cases we include data that affect sort of our inferences about the effectiveness of economic sanctions. And I wonder what your perspective is on that distinction. In particular, for companies that have foreign direct investments in states that are targeted by these sanctions and these sanction threats, it doesn't matter whether the sanctions are about proliferation or currency manipulation. And how should that influence the way that we think about the way that these threats and the sort of sanctions being imposed?
Yeah, I'm glad you draw this attention to what you're right is pejoratively seen by those of us in high politics as, well, that's just business as usual. That really doesn't count. That's on the fringes. I think there are ways in which in the 80s and early 90s, with regard to economic impact, it was kind of on the fringes. But once you go to banking sanctions, once you go to specialized commodity sanctions, you do have a major impact on various sectors in any economy, especially a high trading one like the United States. My own view of this is a very broad continuum of economic statecraft, that sanctions is the major intervention by the government into all aspects of economic life. But short of that, we're regularly making trade deals, we're engaged in tariffs, we're in law enforcement, trying to find money launderers and currency manipulators. We look at intrusions of lower grade products into our economy and decide to set up standards for that and discriminate against trade. There's a lot of that goes on increasingly that's not in what I would call sanctions, which are placed for political reasons. Those are market adjustments in order to protect our own economic actors, but also to make sure that certainly legal patterns of trade and aid don't flow. These lines are becoming increasingly linked. I think that's the key thing about your question, is that the high and the low are meeting in the middle in all sorts of ways. If anybody in our audience is in the midst of law school and thinking, what should I do to be a really high income earning lawyer, study compliance issues on sanctions, because major companies would prefer to pay you $300 to $400 a year to make sure that your knowledge of sanctions saves them from the millions of dollars of fines for running astray of sanctions on Iran or Venezuela or any number of other states. So I think the lines have been crossed. I think commerce, for example, in the US government doesn't get enough credit for the kind of work it does, either implementing sanctions or running kind of sequentially sanctions with also the formulation of new rules, which means you don't need sanctions because you've got new rules. But Treasury and state get all the publicity, partly because their work flows from that high politics of this is why we're going after that target on this issue.
All right, so another question I want to ask is sort of highlighted by some of the episodes that you talked about. So you've commented on the way that there are important changes in which the United States imposes economic sanctions. We have some sanctions against Cuba and Iraq, which are these sweeping economic sanctions that I like to analogize to sort of an older generation of pesticides, being from Kansas, where we used to use in agriculture these broad spectrum pesticides, and we used to use broad spectrum economic sanctions. Now we tend to deploy these targeted economic sanctions that have specific goals and specific companies. The rationale for that move is that you should have fewer negative externalities, particularly in the target state as it pertains to the humanitarian consequences. What about the economic consequences for firms and the sender country? We say that countries trade, but countries don't really trade. Firms and countries trade, and governments pass policies that affect the trade of those companies. So how, if at all, has the shift to these smarter sanctions changed the way that sanctions affect domestic firms?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. A couple of ways. One, let me start by saying the early criteria for sanction success was the sender had a sort of buck up, buckaroo, and absorb some costs. And the more that there were some costs in the domestic environment to us in the United States by sanctioning somebody else, then the harder the resolve we would have to actually get these sanctions to work and then free up our sectors that are being constrained by them. A larger logic says, yes, you impose sanctions on a target, but the folks, as you mentioned, who pay the price initially are folks who have lots of businesses in that country. So in a sense, we're not only withdrawing our businesses from operation, but we're penalizing them if they find other workarounds to try to continue this in its own way for their own viability. I think the key here is that banking sanctions have changed everything. You can't trade, you can't give aid, you can't even sign an agreement in a given future without a banking arrangement. And the dominance of the dollar internationally means that the first adjustment a trading company or a shipping company or an insurance company or even a company that's not trading goods, but sending a lot of its experts over in technology to beef up the technology in the target country, the first thing that complicates their life is they can't move money through banks to pay the people or to absorb the costs of doing business. And that's where the relationship between countries and the Office of Foreign Asset Control and Treasury becomes quite intimate, because they meet a lot to make sure that there's some way you can get a special license in your company to be accepted from the sanctions having the biggest bite on your firm. I think most firms, whether it's a currency revaluation brought about not by sanctions, but by other economic factors, most firms that have to face humanitarian or climate crises in other countries, there's always going to be an adjustment factor. Even the markets that fell apart right away when you sanctioned Venezuela began to restore themselves. And the dramatic changes in prices of oil over the next 18 months after the Venezuela sanctions were not related to the sanctions, they were related to OPEC moves of constraining supply. So companies are always finding ebbs and flows in the market. Is a government intervention by sanctions a new wrinkle for them? Yes. But most companies, most of the time, are able to withstand this and find a way to build it in the cost of doing business in the 21st century.
Okay, so I had a couple other questions prepared, but one of the things you just mentioned touched on one of the questions we have from the audience. So we'll come back to my various questions if we have time. But Martin von Tersch asks, what relationship, if any, is there between the role of the dollar as the world reserve currency and the effectiveness of U.S. economic sanctions?
Yeah, thank you, Martin. It is extremely impactful in a positive way for the ability of the United States singularly to constrain an economy, extremely negative for those in the target country, and one might say also for third parties who are friends of the United States and might understand the US sanctioning of Venezuela or in Iran, but don't want their own business in those countries to pay a price. And one of the new dynamics and development of the last 5 years has been the evolution of secondary sanctions used primarily by the Trump administration to say, if you're trying to be a friend of our enemy, economically, you're our enemy. And so we're going to restrict your trade through the dominance of the dollar. You can't use banks in New York. You can't work with banks that are sanctioned to organize your trade as you have. You do that, and your market and your exports to us are unwelcome here in the United States. So without dollar dominance, you couldn't have the power of sanctions we have. You may remember, or you may not know, that with the Iran sanctions and those imposition of secondary sanctions quite quickly by Secretary Pompeo and Mr. Trump, Europe tried to invent an alternative kind of currency arrangement. And it went to facilitate some trade, but the lift was just too much. The dollar dominance right now contributes to not only the relative squeeze of economic sanctions, but also from many countries, the disdain that comes from the United States probably being too punitive in their mind when we put on these sanctions.
So along those lines, another attendee sort of has a question about, well, if the US continues to push this lever enough, is there a point where we would need to worry about sort of, losing the status of the US dollar as the world reserve currency? Is that something that we could approach plausibly, or is that, as you mentioned, too big of a lift? And so there's a lot of other dynamics at play there. So what's your sense of that?
I think there's a yes and no to that. The yes is the Instex, the invented approach to finance by Europe. It's attracted a lot of attention in other arenas, in Asia especially. But independent of sanctions and independent of the dominance of the dollar, the marketplace has invented cryptocurrency. And cryptocurrency, in a sense, was a product of trying to find a way to move monies even faster and speculate even more without dollar backing about a variety of things. Cryptocurrency is the nightmare of every sanctions officer in Treasury or the UN who's trying to track whether or not North Korea is evading sanctions through illicit banking and shady financial operations. Because once you move to cryptocurrency, even though it looks like, well, you can track it here, here, and here, it's just got to slip under the rug in one illicit financial institution and slip out a different end. And you've lost figuring out, how is North Korea still afloat with these billions of dollars that it got from somewhere? So cryptocurrency is really, really scary here. I understand it's also scary in some other areas of economic life for investors and others. But for sanctions, it can be particularly undermined. And it will be the counter that many states would use, for example, to move away from the dominance of the dollar.
Okay. We have another question that pertains to sort of one of the issues that I had intended to raise. It would not be a sort of conversation about the effectiveness of economic sanctions if we did not ask about the economic sanctions against Cuba. Kirk Doan asks that, or poses the sort of point that President Obama stated that engagement with Cuba was better than sanctions. Was he right?
I mean, I think he's right at many levels. And, let's just ask a question. After 60 years, has this worked? Well, if your goal was, let us never have the Cuban people have any high quality of life like others in the hemisphere because they went socialist with Castro, well, then you'd say, okay, these sanctions worked. But over time, the Europeans, other South American countries, and many states in the United States wondered whether or not this has lost its utility, not the least of which is that there's lots of opportunities for capitalist growth in Cuba, much as there has been in Eastern Europe after 1989. The Castros are now gone for all particular purposes, and bringing this country to its economic knees in 1961 doesn't seem to make any sense in 2021. So Obama's opening, which was similar to some other prior ones about remittances of monies, travel, letting companies explore joint ventures, etc. Yes, there are claims by Cuban families about the stealing of their land. There are various other kinds of things. Most of those things are worked out in other state-to-state situations once you establish diplomatic relations. But what's really at issue here is it doesn't matter that the sanctions work or don't work. Do you want to be the Democratic or Republican politician running for president who says, I think not only the most humane but effective political and economic thing for the entire hemisphere, and certainly for the Cuban people and those in the United States who want to trade with Cuba and build resort areas and take advantage of this, is for us to take the sanctions off Cuba. Well, kiss those Florida votes goodbye in the Electoral College, because there's a strength of the Florida base that's large number of Cubans with a lot of influence that say under no conditions lift those sanctions. And that's what the political process has played to for the last 30 years. I'm convinced from some conversations we had with former Carter officials 2 decades ago that if President Carter had won re-election, he would have brought an end to the sanctions on Cuba, much as he took the kind of view that the Panama Canal really belonged to the Panamanians. And the history of some of this in the hemisphere would have been much different. I believe, as a sanctions analyst, the time for ending sanctions on Cuba has long passed. Let's get things going. Let's be very, very clear that a number of our citizens who are grandchildren of the folks who left or were jailed, they need redress, but we're the litigating country of the world. I know we can litigate this out or make political compromises that will honor the development of the Cuban people and honor Americans of Cuban heritage.
So that's a nice segue. The story that you have about President Carter there. There's a question that occurred to me during your presentation, and John Franklin raises sort of a similar thing. In the experience that you've had, sort of, behind closed doors and under the hood and what have you, are there examples where economic sanctions were not imposed because of the objections of certain domestic firms? Or, are there anecdotes that you can share about how sort of, large multinationals use the leverage that they might have to sort of affect the way that sanctions were written or sanctions were enforced?
Sure. I think the period from the 1970s, which was before my work in sanctions, but from the 70s through the early 90s with regard to South Africa, is the greatest example of the pressure of European and American firms to say there's too much at stake here. This is the gold capital of the world. This is a bulwark against communism in Africa. Let's pursue this policy of constructive engagement. Let's not punish and isolate the South Africans. And when the squeeze does come on with the sanctions over the 80s and early 90s, because of the appalling state of apartheid and the oppression of the entire majority of the country by a small portion of the population, of the white population, that constructive engagement with the additional squeeze actually came with the South African workers and church movements and others saying, yes, sanction us, sanction us, sanction us. So the arguments that American firms had that were hurting the African-American population by too many sanctions, we got to find other ways to persuade the government. When the local population says, no, we're willing to absorb the pain in order to get the transfer of authority finally to the majority, that was an interesting pulling of that argument inside out. I think the worst I've seen wasn't so much companies as much as the action of nation states. I was able to watch over the shoulder of the formation of the Darfur sanctions at the UN Security Council. And when they were initially conceived in what was called Blue Line, there was some 4 dozen groups, companies, and actors from the Sudanese government to private groups that were attacking Darfur that were on the list. By the time China and Russia and another African-friendly state to Sudan got through with it, 2.5 months later, the sanctions passed on Darfur, and we were down to 4 critical actors and 10 associates from the 4 dozen that took the teeth out of this kind of sanctions. I think most of the trade-offs are made in the US sanctions cases by what President Trump and others before him have used. We're imposing these sanctions, but your company and your industry has 90 days to make an appeal or get a specific license. Or in 90 days, this happens, and in 180 days, this other squeeze happens. So the companies have time to adjust, and they do a lot of lobbying. Yes, they begin to pull a tooth here and here of the strength of sanctions, in part because they think there's a limit to which they should suffer for what sometimes is a government policy rather than a policy that's supported by all dimensions of industry.
So that pertains to another question that an attendee has asked. Should we think of tariffs as sanctions? A key problem with the Trump sanctions, for example, seems to have been some advisors supported them to alter the terms of trade, but other advisors supported them to undermine the Chinese Communist Party. Once we've emphasized economics over political purposes, how does that change? And I suppose to sort of frame that in a different way, you know, the sanction episodes that you're discussing are often, economic sanctions are economic pressure applied to achieve a political goal. And sometimes that political goal is not related to the sort of economic policy themselves. But sometimes the sanction is we're imposing tariffs on the target state because the target state has a subsidy for a product that we think is sort of dumping on our domestic industry. And where do we draw the line between those two things, or is it productive to? And or what can we take from one type of economic sanction episode to learn about the other?
No, great question. And I'll go back a little bit to the reference I made earlier about kind of continuum. I think these as discrete actions, sanctions as political clouding devices to achieve ends that do affect certain kind of industries and certain kind of trade policies, used to be very separable and distinct from some of the things you've mentioned, Clay, and our good question. I mean, let's walk it through. Yes, economic statecraft would say, given the subsidies of that government to this high edge technology that's coming into the American system, while American companies are building investment and trying to compete, we're going to impose a tariff on that to make the playing field somewhat level and equal. Our version of a different kind of subsidy. But then later we understand not only is that company continuing trying to find new ways to undersell in our market, but the vast amount of wealth that the corporate group that created the company has is now engaged in undercutting the dollar and the purchasing power of the dollar in their own regional market. And they're doing it by ways in which most currency regulations would say is not permitted in international banking. So what happens is you're in a situation in which trade policy gets tied to sanctions, then sanctions and trade policy now generate a crisis of whether or not illegal activity has happened. And all these things are becoming much more intermixed than they've ever done before. For example, we sanctioned North Korea because of its access to nuclear technologies, and we didn't want them to build a bomb. And the more and more we did that, the more and more they found new ways to get new currencies to finance what they're doing and get in that illegal trade anyway. How did that happen? Because the Kim regime, his father and his grandfather before him, actually had an interesting capitalist streak where they learned how to do things like counterfeit perfect money, hold money in foreign accounts that couldn't be discovered, and found ways to send workers abroad to high-tech areas where they would send back remittances to fund the government. All of this turned out to be illicit money movement that put it in a different area than just nuclear proliferation.
So we have time for one more question, so I'll use my prerogative as the chair to sort of get one of my last issues in, and that's that we've talked about how domestic interests can shape economic sanctions policy. We've talked about the causes and consequences of economic sanctions and how they've changed over time. Given your experience both as a scholar of economic sanctions, but also as somebody who's worked in the implementation and enforcement of economic sanctions, do you have any conjectures that you could share with us about what the future of economic sanctions looks like over the next 10 to 20 years? What sort of developments are we likely to see?
Two things, one technological or let's say in the money area, and that's the cryptocurrency I mentioned before. Cryptocurrency is not only having its impact on investment strategies and currency values and various things, it also can really shake up and assist or really undercut a sanction situation. The second is there's more and more dividing lines and tensions among those of us that are analysts and experts. I tend to believe that sanctions can still and should be very effective in controlling weapons of mass destruction, and they can have relative success in that. I do believe we need sanctions in the case of brutal dictators like we've seen in Myanmar, like we saw in the case of Syria, and like we didn't able to deal with at all under certain conditions in Rwanda. I still think those punishing banking and other sanctions are important for trying to fight against mass atrocities. At the same time, I think when we look at all the conflictual and disaster spots in the world, some of those are already under sanctions and they're in humanitarian crisis. So the third area I see coming up is how do we, in a sense, move from sanctions to incentives to taking off sanctions astutely with regard to a Syria or a Yemen or a Venezuela, where the deterioration of the situation demands we should let economic actors in to try to heal some aspects of the economy. So some of my own work lately is in trying to make the case that Syrian sanctions should be reduced, not because we're not correct in condemning Assad, but unless some of these areas that are now settled and there's peace can get concrete and rebuild buildings, they're going to continue to exist in refugee camps. Yes, some of the concrete comes from Iran and some of the concrete comes from Lebanon, but we can lift these sanctions without betraying our commitments and make life better. So the humanitarian challenges of sanctions, as well as the financing of humanitarian aid through banks, this is a big area for I think the future. Great question. Thank you.
All right, and thank you. So I have been asked to pass it back to Matthew Hughes.
Clayton, thanks. And George, thank you so much. What an incredible conversation tonight, a really deep dive into economic sanctions that is of such value to us as we consider a variety of situations around the world. So George and Clayton, thank you both for your expert discovery and exploration tonight. This has been a really useful conversation for us.
Very good from my end too. I just think this was just a great session. Thank you all.
Yes, happy to do it. Thanks for having me. Really enjoyed the conversation.
And in case the audience doesn't know, this program is particularly special to me because it bridges two dear universities in my life, the University of Notre Dame and the University of Kansas. So again, thanks so much. And thanks to everyone joining us at home. We hope that you enjoyed this program. It was only possible because of the generosity of global citizens like you. If you enjoyed it, we hope that you'll join us and support the IRC. You can take out your phone and text IRC to 44321. Again, you can text IRC to 44321. Do check us out online as well at irckc.org, where you can see the full calendar of upcoming events like this one. Thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you again soon.
Take care, gang.